Hello there, and welcome to Drafting the Past. I'm Kate Carpenter, and in each episode, I interview a historian about their writing process. Today, I'm joined by Duke University historian James Chappel.
Thanks for having me.
James is the author of 2 books. His first book is titled Catholic Modern, The Challenge of Totalitarianism and the Remaking of the Church, and it focuses on the transformation of the Catholic Church in 20th century Europe. But for his second book, which is out now, he has gone in a bit of a different direction. The new book is called Golden Years, How Americans Invented and Reinvented Old Age. We'll get into how he moved between subjects, why he says he's always writing, and how he took a mountain of fascinating research on the history of old age and retirement and turned it into one interesting and easy-to-read book. Here's my conversation with Dr. James Chappel.
I majored in history as being undergrad. I went to Harvard College. I wrote a big undergraduate thesis on Isaiah Berlin. And I realized in the process of that's when I realized that this is what I wanted to do. It was really about I feel like my vocation is as a writer more than as a historian. And when I spent that year just sort of going to the library every day with a big stack of books, I thought, wow, this is the greatest thing. This is what I want to do. And I was so into it that I didn't apply to graduate school. I had no plans at all in the spring of my graduating year. And so I went to teach English in China for a year, which was much more common. I'm dating myself as a historical relic. This is 2005, 2006. I mean, this was a very different moment in U.S.-China relations. This was a very common thing to do for kind of drifting liberal arts graduates. And I thought I'll apply to law school and history school and see where I get in. I got in history school, went to history school at Columbia, wrote a dissertation, then book about the European Catholic Church. I did some public-facing writing, whatever that means, in 2024. Like I wrote a little bit for like The Nation or Boston Review and Dissent, some places like that, which I have enjoyed doing. We can talk about that more. There are also some ways, I've also pulled back from that some myself. There are some ways in which I found it not that fulfilling. And yeah, so I wrote and published that first book, got a job at Duke, and then wrote the book on 20th century American aging that we're here to talk about today.
Well, let's start out with kind of nuts and bolts of your writing process. So when and where do you like to do your writing?
Well, I definitely had and even still nourish a kind of fantasy vision of what my answer would be, where I have like a nice office, I have a room of one's own, I have the tea, the whole thing. I still, even as a 41-year-old man who has never written that way, I still kind of believe that I should. I do not really have a routine. I mainly write at home. I now have small children, and so I write in sometimes early mornings, sometimes late at night. What I imagine my paradigmatic writing experience is like, I do a lot of writing on buses and airplanes. I don't know. I feel like I have very little writing that is even in my office. I think that I don't know, it's like writing in the laptop age. It's a very peripatetic process for me. And I don't know why. There's got to be some reason why I feel drawn to write that way or why I feel resistant to having a very firm routine. Because as you know, that works for a lot of people, but it has not for me. And so if any listeners like me who just like write in little stretches and can't get a routine going, I feel your pain. It's possible to write a book that way.
I'm sure that's reassuring for many people listening. How do you like to organize yourself?
I do feel that I am a pretty organized and disciplined writer. The answer I just gave makes it sound as though I kind of don't take it seriously, which is not true. It's just that I don't fetishize the schedule or the environment. I do try to set kind of word limits or word goals, like 300. I want to write 300 words today, 500 words today, whatever it is. I use Scrivener. I don't know if maybe that seems like old fashioned now. I don't know. Are you familiar with the software?
I use Scrivener.
Oh, you do? Okay. I think I can't imagine writing without it. I have a particular way I set up my Scrivener screens, and if I can't have that, I feel like I can't write at all, almost. And I take it seriously in the sense that, like, I do think it's important to always be writing. I am always writing. I do not distinguish between the research phase and the writing phase. In my experience, it's better to do these things together because it always happens. I've seen it happen in myself and in so many people that there's something scary about writing. There's a kind of fear of writing. And there's so many procrastination tactics. There are obvious ones like smoking a cigarette or playing a video game or closing your computer. But research can also be a procrastination tactic. And I think that historians especially are prone to that because there is always more. There's always more that you can find. There's always one more archive. There's always one more book. There's always one more volume of the journal. And when you combine that with the imposter syndrome that all of us have, it leads a lot of us into kind of a black hole of research. And so I feel that if I have a particular strength as a writer, it is an ability to be researching and writing at the same time. Because, as you're writing, like different questions emerge. Like, I'm sure it's happened to you. It's happened to all of us. Like, we spend a month in some rabbit hole, and then at the end, you're like, wait, that's just one sentence. And in the process of spooling out your chapter, you realize, oh, I need to do this other thing. So, yeah. So I guess always be writing is one thing that I would say.
How do you organize your sources?
There's another way where I imagined that I would be much more structured than I am. I tend to use photographs and PDFs like pretty sparingly. Part of my desire to always be to link together research and writing is I very rarely go to the archive and come back with 10,000 pictures, which I then have to look through. Usually when I go to an archive, I force myself to like take notes, to do critical work while I'm there and take notes and quotes that I think I might want to use. So, I'll just have like a Word document or whatever, or in this case, like a Scrivener page for every archive I go to. I'll take some photos, but I tend a lot more to say, like, here's a file for this archive. And then I organize things pretty early by chapter. Like if I'm reading a bunch of secondary sources, I have in Scrivener a little folder called secondary sources, like chapter 2, secondary sources. And I put everything that might be relevant in there so that when I'm actually writing the chapter, I'm looking all around for stuff. Sometimes if a source is relevant for multiple chapters, I'll put it in multiple different places in Scrivener. So the idea is that, and I'll have another folder for primary sources. So the idea is that, in Scrivener, you have multiple windows. For me, I have a window where I'm writing, and the other window, I'm toggling between primary and secondary sources that I'm going to use for this chapter. That's my ambition for how I write. It doesn't come. I definitely don't use Zotero or anything like that. I take a lot of pride in my footnotes. I love doing them myself. I also have never really learned how to use one.
So then what does your revision process look like? How do you think about that phase?
I find revising to be very painful. It is because it's not as fun, right? It's like the fun part is like diving into your sources, coming up with your argument, all that stuff. And then, printing it out and reading it and seeing how flawed it is and having to go back and do it. It takes a lot, I think, of, I don't know what, mental fortitude, but it is really important. And I remember my first book, I did a writing workshop on it, like with other faculty from Duke and some, like I think one or two invited guests and an editor or something like that. And of course, like any author, what I wanted was everybody to just give me like a round of applause and tell me this is done. Like this is a 1-minute workshop. This is the best book we've ever seen, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, that didn't happen. And I came away knowing I have to rewrite this whole thing again. And it was so dispiriting. It took another 9 months or whatever, but it was totally worth it. I had to. I mean, in this book too, Golden Years, I probably rewrote every chapter at least once or twice. I really thought that having written a book once, that the second time it would just kind of flow from me, that I would just like, oh, now I know how to write a book, so I won't have to do as many revisions. But that was not true. I had to do as many revisions and rewrites on the second book as the first one.
Speaking of first and second books, your first book, The History of Catholicism in 20th Century Europe, which, as far as I can tell, is a pretty different topic than the history of old age and retirement in the United States. What was it like to switch gears like that for a second book?
I found it really energizing. There definitely was with the first book. It came out of a particular moment of, post 9/11, sort of thinking a lot about religion and politics. Like when I was in graduate school, writing about religion and modern European history was sort of hot stuff. There were a lot of conferences. I had a lot of friends in the field. So it was very fun to write that book. And then when it was done, and I was thinking, okay, I mean, the logical thing for me to do is to write, another book about this topic. I still think there's a book to be written about Vatican II. If there's anyone out there like a global history of Vatican II, I still think is a book someone's got to write. And for some reason, a lot of people organize their careers that way, and I envy them. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. But I found that I could not do it. I found that I needed to. I think it goes back a little bit to what I said earlier about imagining my vocation as much as a writer, as a historian. I found the idea of cementing myself as an expert in this particular thing a noble enterprise, but not kind of what I wanted. I felt like I had different questions had emerged for me, and I wanted to explore them. I mean, in the interim, also, I mean, this is something that marks me as a figure of great privilege, is that I had gotten tenure in the interim, and so if tenure is for anything, surely it has to be to allow yourself to, you know, explore different things. There is, of course, a thematic connection between the books. It's not like my second book is a totally different discipline. So the first book actually has a little bit about old age pensions. And when I wrote the book, I regretted what a short passage it was, because on the one hand, like it sounds so boring, but on the other hand, I thought like, wow, it's actually like a third of these countries' GDP is going to old age pensions, and the way they're imagined and the way they're structured seems super important. And Catholics play a big role there, and Catholic ideals of the family and stuff like that. And I originally was going to write a book about pension policies in Europe or in Germany. And I actually did some publications on that. For a number of reasons, I decided not to. One was the pandemic and the having of children. And so, I mean, this book was written over a course of 2 or 3 years when I wasn't even allowed to go to my office, let alone go to Germany, you know. Um, and and as I'm sure some listeners can sympathize, when you have little kids at home, I'm not going to Dusseldorf for 9 months. That's crazy. I can't do that. So, because it seemed impossible to write this European book in the way that I would want to, and also there was a matter of interest too. I mean, this is probably happening in lots of different subfields, but European history uh, is, let's say, not as strong as it has been historically. Like, there's not that much interest in it. So, like, I could not really find a publisher for old age history of old age in Germany, right? I mean, who's going to read that? Like, there's people who buy books about German history in general is very small. The number of those who care about history of old age is like, who's going to buy this book? And so, I guess when I was thinking what my actual disciplinary training prepares me to do is to write a book that I would think is very interesting, but that I don't think there'd be much of a market for. I don't think it would make much of an impact. And so I thought, well, why don't I try just writing this book about America? I mean, it's sources that I can find here. It There was a learning curve, obviously, to learn about American history, but I found that to be exciting. I don't know. I think it's fun to learn new things. Of course, I feel some kind of nervousness about it. I felt some nervousness about writing about a different geographical area. Like, it's methodologically, the two books are very similar, but obviously geographically they're not. And I felt nervous about that. But I don't know, maybe once upon a time people were very zealous about gatekeeping in these ways, but I don't think right now. I think right now people really welcome kind of new perspectives and new people and interlopers and things like that. So I've, so far at least, found myself like very welcomed by Americanist colleagues.
It also, you moved from a university press for your first book to a trade press for the second book. How did that shift feel? What was that like for you?
It's an experiment. I don't know. I thought I would. I wanted to try new things with this book. One new thing is writing about America. One new thing is writing with the trade press. So far, I've had a great experience. I mean, they really. I don't want to cast any aspersions on Harvard University Press, which was the home of my first book. They did a great job, but it's different. They have different goals. They have different levels of resources they can bring to bear, especially for book publicity. And there is not a peer review process. That's the biggest, I say, single difference, at least between this trade press and that university press. Because, of course, at the university press, it went through peer review, right? And so that's why I think that for first books, that's very much recommended, because it's for tenure and you really want to show that you have kind of, I don't know, check the boxes of disciplinary expertise in your field. The Trade press is not so concerned with that. It's not their job. Their job is to like publish important books that will sell. I would say that it's not like they're hostile to the idea. I organized my own workshop with some Americanist colleagues because that to me at least was important. And so yeah, I don't know. So I would say actually so far with that exception, the peer review exception, I have not found the experience that different. I mean, Basic does publish a lot of academics. They publish like maybe if I were with like Penguin or Norton or something like that, it would feel different. But I don't know that the writing. I tried to write a little bit more accessibly, but there is room in trade presses like Basic for books that are academic books. I mean, one thing I discovered about myself is that I am fundamentally an academic writer. I did wonder a little bit when I started writing this, like, do I have it in me to write something that will actually be a kind of gripping, character driven yarn, the way that some historians can do? And I discovered that I can't. That's not me. I don't know. I kind of tried a little bit, but it's just not how I was trained. It's not how I think about history. And so the book reads a little bit more academic, I think, than maybe how I initially envisioned. But I think that's just like kind of discovering who I am as a writer in the course of writing it.
To see more about how that discovery came to life on the page, I asked James to read an excerpt from his new book. Here's James Chappel reading the introduction to Chapter 2 of Golden Years, How Americans Invented and Reinvented Old Age.
In November 1939, a woman named Ida Fuller retired from her job as a legal secretary in a small town in Vermont. She was unmarried and had no children. She was therefore the kind of person who would, at most times in American history, have had a challenging time in old age. She might have had to rely on charity or even enter an almshouse. Fuller, though, knew that for the last few years she'd been paying for something called Social Security. She didn't know much about the program and had voted against Franklin Roosevelt, the president who made it possible. All the same, she stepped into a government office to inquire. She didn't expect anything to come of her query, but she was in luck. As it happens, that was the very day the first application forms for the new program had arrived. She filled them out, and just 2 months later, a check arrived in her mailbox with the auspicious number of 00-000-001. Miss Ida Fuller thus entered the history books as the nation's first recipient of Social Security. Fuller was one of many millions of people whose lives were shaped by Social Security, which was the grandest expansion of the welfare state in American history. It has played an incalculable role in shaping the American economy and the life course of American citizens. Social Security has also been the greatest poverty reduction program in American history. According to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, in 2022, the program kept 21.7 million Americans above the poverty line, most of whom were over age 65. The program also helped people with disabilities and some other target groups. It is largely thanks to Social Security and its many amendments, of which Medicare is one, that old age in America is as good as it is. Social Security hasn't just made old age better. The program was responsible for the invention of old age in this country. Before 1935, there was very little sense that old age was a coherent stage of life with its own institutions and benefits. Youth was certainly understood that way, as a time for state-sponsored education, but old age was not. Not many older people were retiring, and few of the institutions that we associate with modern aging existed yet. Retirement communities, senior centers, nursing homes, and so on. Social Security created for the first time a legitimate expectation that Americans could look forward to 10 or 15 years of comfortable life on the far side of the labor market. It created, in other words, a broadly shared idea of what old age could be.
Talk to me about what goes into writing this passage.
I find chapter introductions to be kind of a fun part of the writing. I usually do them last. I find, and this is part of the revision process we talked about earlier, because I'm sort of always writing, one of the downsides of that is that I have to cut a lot of what I write because I don't do a lot of research, rigorously outline my chapter, and then write. Even though I ask my students to do that, it's not what I do. I kind of write as I go, discover my argument in the course of the writing. And then a lot of the revision has to do with like whittling down the massive prose I've created to turn it into an argument. And then a kind of fun part then is to say, okay, how can we introduce this chapter? How can I give it some kind of a hook for people? As I said before, I have a hard time, I think, in terms of like in groups of people, big historical shifts, the kinds of things that I think are kind of hard to narrate. And so I sought for each chapter introduction to find some kind of like exemplary anecdote. And this one about Ida Fuller is anyone who knows about the history of Social Security will have heard of her, but that's not many people. I mean, she was a minor celebrity in her time, and she was actually kind of followed up on by journalists over the rest of her life. And I think she actually comes up again in a later chapter a little bit. And so I thought that by introducing her, I could help people put a face to it. I would say that the thing I did in that introduction that was a little bit different than what had been done with her before was to think, okay, what would have happened to this woman absent Social Security? Like, given what we know about her, that she's unmarried, that blah blah blah, how does this impact her in particular? And so that was a little bit of a thought experiment that I did in that passage. And then the chapter itself then goes like back in time. It jumps back to about 1930 to kind of narrate how we got to this moment when this, older woman in Vermont is able to get this money from the government.
One thing that makes this book really a pleasure to read, and I really enjoyed it, is just how direct and clear the language is, and explain what are often pretty actually complex policy changes in ways that are not only easily understandable, but actually enjoyable to read. And,
Oh, thank
and
you.
I noticed when I was reading the acknowledgments that you thank your students in part for that, for helping you really clarify language. Can you talk a little bit about how you think about the relationship between teaching and writing?
We spend as much as I've talked about having a vocation as a writer. It's a reality of most of our lives that we spend more time teaching than we do writing. You talked about when you asked me about writing, I thought mainly about when I do it during the day. There's another question about when I do it during the year, which I'm teaching a lot and like teaching grad students and like to be a professor in 2024. I'm advising clubs. I mean, it's all kinds of stuff, and so this is really kind of a summer enterprise. I will say something I've started doing this year for the first time, and this is another kind of privileged thing that maybe not everybody can do. I have rigorously stopped having any meetings of any sort on Mondays. And I've tried to say it's a no meeting Monday. It is this time is for writing. Monday is purely for writing. And I have found that to be a pretty good exercise so far this year because it's very hard. Even people like your grad students listening, like it's very hard to find time to write when you're also teaching and applying for jobs and applying for fellowships and all that stuff. And so I offered to you as an idea to say, try to set aside a whole day for it in each week. Because teaching can be like, I guess that's about the ways that teaching can be a distraction from writing. It makes it hard to write and teach at the same time because teaching is exhausting. You're getting ready to teach. It's like I'm not a super social person, so I find it a little bit draining to teach. I find it hard to teach and write like on the same day. But that said, I think that the practice of lecturing, especially, is really good for a writer because I think that to lecture properly is to lecture in a way that anyone can understand you and to try to have an imagined listener who is interested in your topic but knows nothing about it. And I think having an audience member like that in mind as you write can be really important. It's hard to do when you're writing a dissertation. Your imagined audience is your advisor who you're trying to impress. And that fact, while very explicable, is behind the torturous prose of many dissertations because you're trying to prove something rather than to explain something. The worst lectures that I see are when people are trying to prove how smart they are. That creates a lecture that cannot be understood. And so I think it takes a little bit of like humility to say, that's not the point of this lecture. I'm not trying to prove to you how smart I am. I'm trying to explain a concept to you. And I think that if you can take that sensibility, I think produces good lectures. It also produces, I think, good writing because I presumed in writing like this chapter that the reader had no idea what Social Security was, because probably most people kind of don't. Like it's pretty complicated. It's a tax that comes out of our things. It's like every 4 years, everyone talks about how they want to save Social Security. But I think if you ask them in on the street, like exactly how does this program work, people don't know. It's super complicated, and so it can feel kind of like I felt a little bit I don't know what the right word is, but when I was writing some parts of it, of this book, I felt like, oh, this is so elementary. The experts will already know this. They're going to think this is boring. But I had to convince myself, remind myself, like, that's not who this book is for. That's what makes this also tricky, though, because that's who will actually review the book. And there's also a case in which, like, it's possible that that's the only people that will read the book. But I tried to write it in a way that would meet people where they were.
I like that. I also think we take for granted, even very well educated, well informed readers and reviewers are busy and like things that
Of course.
are not a huge slog. You talked a little bit about structure earlier in terms of like you kind of imagined this potential like character driven narrative and went a different direction. And I think the book's narrative structure, like it's pretty straightforward and it's really lovely. I think it functions in a really clear way. But I also imagine that there were other ways you could have written it. How did you come to the structure you landed on?
That's an interesting question. I've often thought this, that like when you open a book, the structure always feels like completely obvious. Like here's a book right here that I don't know. I'm teaching this book. It's this book called "Did It Happen Here? Perspectives on Fascism in America." This is a big book that just came out. And there's a part one is about classic texts. Part two is about fascist analogies. Part three is about this. Part four is about that. When you open a book and read it, that structure becomes very naturalized. You're like, of course, that's the way to tell the story. Like you kind of start your critical evaluation there. But as anyone who has written a book knows, to figure out how to structure it is like the hardest part. And with both of my books, the actual structure emerged pretty late in the day in terms of like how I was going to intellectually organize these chapters. Like how are they connected to each other? Where do we put the temporal breaks? What periods are we covering? Like how many parts does it have? How many chapters does it have? I find that stuff to be extremely difficult. And this book is organized, and it was something that came pretty late. It's the kind of thing that probably any reader of the book will think like, oh, well, of course, this is the most obvious. This is the obvious way to organize the history of old age in 20th century America, is that there's to organize it around terminology. That for the first third of the century, older people were called the aged, generally. In the middle third of the century, they were mainly called senior citizens. And since about 1975, they've been called older people as they are today. And so each of those terminologies is linked with a different kind of cultural and policy environment. And so, yeah, three parts of the book. Each one's got a few chapters. Bada bing, bada boom. But, it takes forever to get there. That was not how it started at all. In fact, the first entire draft of the book did not have that. Did not have that. Like when I had the book workshop, that was not the structure. I don't remember what the structure was, but it wasn't that. And I felt unsatisfied with the structure before. I think it's important to come up with some kind of structure that the reader can understand, like pretty easily, how the different chapters fit together and how they create a historical arc. But it is hard to do that. And so I guess I would say, I guess the piece of advice there for listeners is if you've got a dissertation or a book with like 7 or 8 chapters and you think, okay, they're kind of chronologically ordered, I would say, I don't know, push that a little bit further to think about how you can make the structure of your book work for you better.
I'm also struck that there's so much interesting information in this book. In fact, it's one of those rare books that while I was reading it and afterwards, I kept bringing up in conversation, like, did you know that? Which is really
That's
fun.
great.
But I have to imagine there's also a lot more information about aging and retirement that you did not have room for in the book.
Oh, yes.
Or else
Yeah.
you would have had like a 600-page book.
Yeah.
What were your strategies for deciding what would go into the book and what you would leave out?
This is a painful question because so much is on the cutting room floor. That is another kind of big piece of writing advice. Everybody says this. And, if people use this, do people still use this terrible phrase of kill your babies? That's still a thing
I think
people
so.
say.
Or murder your darlings. Yeah.
Yeah. We should stop saying that. I don't know, but it's like, but the advice of, if there are parts of your writing that you are going to think are great, but if they do not work for your structure, they just got to go. Yeah, you have to kill them because it makes your writing so much stronger. And this book had so many darlings that were murdered because there was so much to say. I mean, there's so much. There's so many individual stories, so many even thematic stories that I had to leave behind. Like, I wanted a chapter about old age and the environment. I wanted a chapter about old age and technology. Like, I have so much on these topics, but it just didn't fit. And I mean, the book is regular length. I mean, it's the contracted 100,000 words, and I couldn't make it fit. And so sometimes it feels like there's a choice between trying to cram in information and cutting stuff, even though you love it, in the interest of making a more readable book. And I mean, it's not for me to decide if I did that successfully or not. I tried to do that. And I'm sure you believe me, there is so much on the cutting room floor of this book because it's a vast topic. I mean, that's another thing about this particular book is that the source base was challenging to identify. My first book was about Catholic intellectual history. And so it's pretty easy to imagine. I mean, I feel like I made some innovative choices about sources in that book, but basically, you can imagine a room with like a stack of theology books and like intellectual journals and the Pope's pronouncements and stuff like that. And basically, that's the book. With this book, it's a way harder because there's so many ways you could approach it, like movies, TV, newspapers, individual stories, memoirs of caregivers. Like the amount of material was overwhelming. And I don't know if I even am able to give advice about that because a lot of topics are going to be like that, especially people who are writing about the later 20th century. Like the amount of stuff that's digitized is just insane. It creates such a waterfall of information. I guess all I would say is that I think that in a way that makes our job even more important because when confronted with this waterfall of information, one thing that we can do as historians is try to like put it on 1,000 buckets and try to save it all and put it in our chapter. But another thing we can do is be the person who steps back and says, what does this waterfall mean? And choose a few examples to show us that waterfall. Because I think that when regular people read history books, by which I mean books that like, you or I might write, like professional historians, I don't think they ever say, "Oh, I wish there was more examples. Oh, I wish there was more individual vignettes." I think that always what people say is like, "There's too much information here. It was too complicated." And even, I mean, you probably feel this way too. I feel this way if someone sends me a book to review and it's 400 pages long, and I open it up and it's like every page is about some different thing. My heart sinks. And so I think, I don't know what to say about it, except that it is a duty incumbent upon us, I think, to be harshly selective in what we decide to discuss and to not discuss. That's like a duty we have to the reader to say, like, you reader are going to spend 6 hours of your time on this or whatever. I want to make it worth your while. I want to show you what I think is the diamonds I found in the rough instead of giving you like a bunch of junk that you then have to interpret.
I want to switch gears a little because I want to go back to something you said that I thought was really interesting and I wanted to ask you about, which was that you talked about how you've written for some more public outlets, but that you've also kind of found that maybe not as satisfying as you thought you might and have pulled back. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I'm not sure how firmly I believe that. I'm sure that it'll come and go in waves. I mean, it is the beauty and the pitfall of that kind of writing is that it's ephemeral. And it still takes a lot of time to do that. It takes a lot of time to write one. Like, so you see some article in The Nation or whatever, 1,200 words. It takes a long time to write something, at least for me, to write something like that. And it probably is read more. It's definitely read more than something that you might write in an academic journal. But it also is read quickly and disposed of quickly. And it's not like it's not like you feel like you made a big impact on the public discourse, right? There are some historians out there who do this very well, and I think are providing a kind of irreplaceable service to the public weal. Most of us are not like that. Most of us do it because it's kind of fun. It's a change of pace. It feels important to make some kind of contribution to the public square when we can. But I I think I'll say that there was a time in my life when I found that to be very energizing, and I imagine I will feel that way again. But right now, I don't feel that way. Right now, I think, wow, we live in a world, talk about waterfall, and then we say like fire hose of information and a fire hose of like takes. And one thing, at least I can do, is perform a different kind of labor and like produce a book that could conceivably be read for a little bit and could conceivably live beyond me. and it can be on a shelf. I don't know, and I guess that is a little bit of like a romantic feeling I have about books. And so like I've already kind of started writing a third book just because I like the idea of writing books. It feels like a vocation to me.
Are there other writers who you look to for inspiration, people you read as either models of craft or historical work?
We all have kind of edible relations with our advisors. My advisor is Samuel Moyne, who I look up to enormously. Has been like such an enormous help to me and so many other students. I think that's something I've taken from him is well, I don't know if I've taken from him or not, but what I've aspired to take from him is a kind of clarity and economy of prose and a willingness to be wrong in the sense of like to make an argument clearly enough that it is falsifiable. And I think that historians, especially, can have a tendency to pile up so many examples and qualifications that the work becomes unfalsifiable. It's simply like a mass of evidence that you've produced. And I mean, there's a time and place for that, absolutely, but it's not what I've aspired to be. I've definitely gotten from him the idea that every book or chapter is meant to make an assertive, potentially wrong argument. And it is kind of your duty as a writer to name what you think that is. And that's like scary to do, but he always does that. And he's attracted a lot of flack for it. And it takes some, I don't know what, writerly courage, but it's something that I aspire to for sure.
What's the most influential writing advice you've ever gotten?
Ooh. I had an interesting experience with a faculty member here at Duke named Kristen Neuchel, who is a medievalist. And you've heard me say a few times that I consider writing to be a vocation of mine. And I would not have used that language 5 years ago. I would have considered myself to be a historian, a researcher, a teacher, etc. And I was talking to her about writing, and she talked about the way she identifies herself as a writer first and foremost. And I had never thought about that before. I think that I had sort of assumed that I wasn't allowed to call myself that. Like historians weren't allowed to call themselves that. That was only for like, I don't know, people who were like cooler and sexier and like poets or whatever. Like we couldn't be a writer because I wasn't like Hemingway or something like this. But I thought, no, I'm a writer. And there's so many historian writers in the past. Like, the book I'm writing now is about C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis was a historian and he was a writer. He was a writer first and foremost. And there's a Burke. I mean, I don't know. There's so many people who are historian writers that we can imagine ourselves as Hofstadter, like Woodward. There's so many that we can imagine ourselves as part of a lineage. And I took that to heart. I think there's a way, and this is just historians are different. Sometimes we think about ourselves as social scientists, like our job, we are basically sociologists who use some narrative. And I probably at some points in my career have thought about myself that way, but I currently now think about myself more as like a novelist who uses some evidence. And so I think that conversation with Kristen kind of clarified I don't know, my commitment to writing as a craft. This is why I wanted to do a podcast like this one. Once she told me that, it kind of crystallized something for me that had been true about myself. And it's probably true for like a lot of listeners too. But it was an identity that I hadn't allowed myself to inhabit before.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways that to me gets back to the fact that we don't talk enough about craft in history. It keeps us from thinking of ourselves as writers.
That's right. That's right. The thing about the way we read a book in graduate school is to kind of like to gut it for parts, basically. And like kind of, well, what is the argument? What is the evidence, etc. And there's like, obviously that's how I read a book still. There's a place for that. But no, we're making works. We're making works of art, whether we like it or not, in the sense of art as a craft. We are producing something that we may as well be attentive to the ways we do it. And that's what makes a podcast like this so valuable.
Before I let you go, as we are speaking, Golden Years is not out yet, but it will be by the time this episode airs. So I know that you were deep in promoting it, talking about it. You have though hinted
so you listeners, unlike me now, you're in golden years fever. Golden Years fever is sweeping the country.
It is everywhere.
Wow. So this is a historical relic before the nation caught the fever. Okay.
Exactly, precisely. But you have hinted at, and I'll now ask you about a new project you're working on, because I am always really interested in how historians kind of move from subject to subject. So are you up for talking a little bit about the third book you're thinking about?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, for me, I have found that, I talked before about feeling some anxiety around thinking of myself as a social scientist because my historical concerns have always so closely mirrored, let's say, personal anxieties and personal concerns, which change as we age. I mean, that's I talked before about how I didn't think I could stick with the same topic. It was because I'm a different person than I was when I was 20 and I was thinking about that first project when I was 25 or whatever. And so, I wrote that first book in a moment when I was like really grappling with my evangelical upbringing, and it was like post 9/11, and I was really obsessed with religion and all this stuff. That was that first book. The second book was about like a period when I was having kids and getting older. And I turned 40 while I was writing this book, and I had aging parents, like a lot of us do, and I felt like, wow, the process of aging is something that is happening to me. I need to be thinking about this, and so that's what led to that book. And actually was like, I often find that the two books I've written and the one I'm writing are all kind of like, is not so much about identifying gaps in the literature, but writing about books that I wished had already existed, that I wished I wouldn't have had to write. Like this book, I wanted to read A History of Old Age in America since Social Security, but there kind of wasn't one. And so I thought, well, there ought to be one. So I'm writing one. And so this new project I've started, I don't know, the risk of being too personal. I've started in the last year or two. My family started going to an Episcopal church, and so my kids are being baptized in the church and things like that. I'm thinking a lot about that tradition, which is like, my family is from England. This is like my ancestral tradition in a way. So I've been like reading Milton and trying to imagine like what it is to inhabit this particular kind of Anglican Episcopal tradition. And there was somebody who had been thrust on me so much that I had decided that I hated this person without ever really giving it a thought. It was C.S. Lewis. And I thought, well, all right, now I should give C.S. Lewis a chance. And so I read C.S. Lewis and thought that he was like an amazing person and thinker and writer and all this stuff. And I wanted to learn more about him. And the literature on him is almost complete. There's almost nothing historical about him. It's all kind of like theologians, literary scholars, people like that. It's great scholarship, but it's not history. And all of his apologetic works are written during World War II. And so I'm thinking right now really hard about like, what does it mean to be a Christian during wartime? What are our obligations? And I thought, well, maybe thinking about Lewis as a wartime Christian, that's really like all of his famous Christian writings come out during the war. Could be an interesting way for me to kind of grapple with those questions. And so I guess a piece of like writerly, I don't know if I'm in any position to offer writerly advice, but something that has marked my career, and maybe some listeners would think there's something disallowed about it, is that it's totally fine to write about stuff that's like impacting your life. And that because whatever we write about, we're going to have to bend, we're going to have some kind of libidinal pull to this material if you're going to get a book written, right? Otherwise, it's not possible. It's too much work. The work to reward ratio is way off writing a book. And unless you're getting something from, unless it's speaking to a pretty deep part of yourself, I don't think that you'll be able to write the book. And that's definitely been true for me. So yeah, so that's like one thread through my book projects.
Dr. James Chappel, thank you so much for joining me on Drafting the Past and talking about writing with me.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Drafting the Past. You'll find links to James's books and other books mentioned in this episode at draftingthepast.com. If you enjoyed the show, please share it with your friends. After all, friends don't let friends write boring history.